Okay, everyone, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the break. We're going to get going again with the final panel of the conference for this afternoon, and it's going to be me who's going to chair this one. And we're going to start off with Giti Chandra, who, let me just find her profile. So she's currently senior researcher at GEST, UNESCO program in Reykjavik, and has been associate professor at the Department of English at Stevens College, Delhi. She's also author of the book Guardians trilogy, The Fang of Summoning, Bones of the Stars, and The Eye of the Archer. Her mostly sci-fi short stories and most seminal poetry have been published in various amazing publications. Sadly, nobody cares about her first non-fiction book, a groundbreaking academic work on violence, but the next two on the Me Too movement and colonial violence are going to be bestsellers. Giti writes poetry in April, paints on Tuesdays, and has a PhD from Rutgers, and she feels that people would do well to learn that a cello is not an oversized violin. She lives in Reykjavik with a husband, 2 kids, a dog, and a cat. And I'm very pleased to introduce her today, who's going to, especially because her talk is going to be about an interdisciplinary approach to the challenges facing Pratchett Studies today. And it's a topic close to my heart. So on you go. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, James. I hope everyone can hear me, right? Audio is working? Okay, great. So I'm just going to go right into it. In 1559, overcome with horror at the idea of a woman on the throne of England, John Knox blew what he called his first blast of the trumpet, publishing a pamphlet titled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. It was the first of 3 such blasts in which Knox argued that a female monarch was against the orders of God, man, and nature, and he marshaled biblical and other holy scripture, the ancient pagan philosophers, and his own wisdom in order to make his point. As we know, neither Elizabeth of England nor Mary Queen of Scots lent him their ears, but the trumpet blasts have reverberated down through the ages, and the idea of the monstrous regiment has not been forgotten. In this paper, I'm going to use this idea and its legacy to think through how different disciplines can be brought to bear on an analysis of Pratchett's work at the intersection of critical literary analysis of the genre of fantasy, the political ideologies of feminism, and the humanist idea of an egalitarian future. 2 women writers have taken up here we go. Can everyone hear me again? Okay, great. Thanks. I think this happened while I was trying to change the slides. All right, there. Anyway, that's John Knox delivering his first blast of the trumpet. So here's the first of the novels by Clemence Dane. So 2 women writers have taken up the title of Knox's work, and while both novels are set in the same time period, they're separated in writing by about 80 years. And the difference is clearly evident in the treatment of Knox's legacy. Clemence Dane's 1917 novel, the covers of which you see here, titled Regiment of Women, explores the hothouse hysteria-inducing environment of an all-girls school, revealing the not very subtle sexual undercurrents in intense student-teacher and junior-senior faculty relationships. However, all is settled and pushed back under its rug when a young man is inserted into the narrative in order to restore calm and balance and heteronormativity, and the young heroines leave the older colleague to marry him and live happily ever after. And you can see from the different covers that publishers have chosen the way that they choose to interpret this regiment of women thing, especially the one in the center right on top, where it's very obvious what will happen if you put a lot of women together, apparently. So this one is Laurie R. King's Mary Russell detective series, and it's called A Monstrous Regiment of Women. Set in 1920, it's written in 1995 and carries the sensibility of the late 90s feminism. King exposes the misogyny of Knox's pamphlet in the character of the mystic Marjorie Child, who preaches her conviction that men kept women silent because they were afraid to face the consequences of acknowledging the equality of men and women. In the conversations Marjorie has with Mary Russell, the female protagonist of the book, King offers a rereading of the Bible to prove that its texts have been historically rewritten and interpreted to obscure the inherent equality of the sexes that the Bible originally meant to advocate. So both these novels are written well within their realist mode and offer interesting and complex readings of Knox's notion of the monstrosity of women in positions of authority. While Daines's novel gives at best an agonized and traumatized feminism that is afraid to call itself by its name, King's crime fiction offers an overt ideological format, determined to provide an authenticity to feminism that has historically been denied to it. Pratchett's Monstrous Regiment is written by a man and a fantasist, published in 2003 and set in what could be a possible present in any of a number of recognizable geographical and historical settings. I'm going to divide my interrogation of Monstrous Regiment into two halves. First, I'd like to look at how the sense of the future and the monstrous is set up by Knox and by Pratchett, what this has to do with fantasy, and why these are significant for us. And in the second half, I'm going to offer a reading of Pratchett's novel that establishes the ways in which fantasy filters feminism and gender issues, to give a valuable contribution to our understanding of what a feminist world might look like. As Jane Austen reminds us, a universe is made up of the truths that everyone agrees to acknowledge. Thus, she asks her reader to enter into a contract with her, the writer, that binds them both to be citizens of the universe of the shared text of the book, by acknowledging the truths of the universe that the book sets out, that a man in possession of a good fortune must be in search of a wife. Thus, it becomes possible for reader and writer to fruitfully communicate with each other, and the text becomes a shared universe that they can both inhabit. She is, in the words of fantasy writers, world building, and in her own straightforward yet elegant way, she lets the reader know this. I will argue that John Knox, too, indulges in some world building of his own, even though the truths that he gestures to are all assumed acknowledged by his readers because they all originate and draw their authority from an absolute power called God. Yet, as we see in the passage that I've quoted here, Knox is careful to first fabricate a world picture of God in this our age, and then to insert the author into it. God has revealed to some, that is himself, making him, Knox, a true messenger of God to whom the truth is revealed. Thus, the true messenger of God, who serves as a mouthpiece of God's truths, issues revelations of these truths to the universe at large, manifesting God's will and creating a world resting now on the authority of Knox, not of God. To challenge Knox is now to challenge God. Thereby is constructed a circular form of authority and authorization. God's world has prophets. I am a prophet in God's world. The world is my prophecy. The author is now self-authorizing, drawing authority from himself, and the reader can choose his world, a utopia, or dissent from it and choose the alternative, the apocalypse. The crucial question, however, is who will control the future. The idea of the future in Knox's universe is one in which eternal authority, God or Knox's, relegates the visions to the book of Revelations. Thus, the future is always a closed option. It is static, it's predetermined, it's unavailable. It does not participate in the linear notion of time because there is no linear notion of time. In Knox's treatise, the past, as static and prefabricated as the future, has been constructed from scraps of carefully selected scripture, philosophy, and historical anecdote. It points only and always to the fixed futures of utopia or apocalypse. There's heaven or hell. Knox is able to gesture to an imminent apocalypse, where the apocalypse is a predetermined, pre-written future that can be summoned whenever the present needs to be pushed back into an equally manufactured past. In the manner of most conservative ideologies, the past is presented in two ways. One, as a glorious age in which everyone knew their place and praised God for their repressed status, and two, a more realist era in which rebellions were put down with a brutal hand and status quo was maintained through a heavy-handed patriarchy. What then to do with the present? A changeable and changing thing that puts women on the throne, masses of unquiet populations at the castle and church gates, and anxiety into the hearts of self-styled prophets. A present that is the contested site of rebellious masses, women kings, and courtiers who conspire to raise women above all men. Well, the present must be admonished and controlled to remind its multitudes that authority cannot be usurped and that the truth belongs always and only to the author of that truth. It may seem self-evident that while Knox invokes the non-real nature of God and his authority to authorize his world building, and by his extension himself as the authority to which the word of God is heard, this non-real must be clearly distinguished from the fantastical. For Knox, the fantastical flashes through when he speaks of monsters, to which I'm going to come in a minute. While you or I may wonder how exactly Knox's non-real is different from the fantastical, Pratchett is quite clear as to the differences and takes pains to acquaint the reader with them. You could argue that any writer of fantasy shares a nudge and wink with her reader even before the cover is lifted, a kind of mutual acknowledgement of the fictionality of the narrative to come, which is not even going to pretend to realism. Fittingly then, Terry Pratchett underscores the importance of acknowledging the constructedness of belief and ideology, thoroughly aware of his own status as author of fantasy. In this particular narrative, Pratchett's nudge and wink take in the underlying text that he's writing on, that is John Knox's Monstrous Regiment Blast, asking the reader to compare the manner in which Knox builds his authority world as imminent and immutable, while he, Pratchett, builds change and mutability into his world as a necessary component. He does this in the only way that it can be done, by pulling the rug of the absolute from under the feet of immutability. Without an absolute authority or a god to hold the God-built and God-run world in its grip, the world is suddenly open to possibilities and probabilities, free will and choice. And so deliberately, and with a certain amount of relish, Pratchett announces the death of God. Or, to be more specific, the aging and falling into senility and dementia of a God. God is not so much dead as gone, dwindled, no longer with us. His commands are now mere echoes, the words changing, making nonsense. Indeed, there is no God. There is only the part that hates the other that will not change, fear. And then Pratchett redefines a God that divides his world into beatitudes and abominations that will take the present into either a utopia or an apocalypse. He is fear personified and given power. You fear tomorrow, and you've made fear your God. Throughout the narrative, therefore, Pratchett is invested not in telling us how feminism will create a utopian world for us, but how to abolish fear. The future is not a time, it is a mode of thought. And fantasy allows us to imagine what that mode of thought may be and what the people who think that way might look like. Knox knew what such people look like. In the natural body of man, God has appointed an order that the head shall occupy the uppermost space, the head he has joined with the body, that from its life and motion do flow to the rest of the members. In it he has placed the eye to see, the ear to hear, and the tongue to speak, which offices are appointed to none other member of the body. The rest of the members have every one their own place appointed, but none may have neither the place nor office of the head. This is John Knox, and it's a fairly traditional view of the world as body and hierarchy and so on. For who would not, he writes, judge that body to be a monster, where there is no head eminent above the rest, but that the eyes were in the hands, the tongue and the mouth beneath in the belly, and the ears in the feet. Men, I say, should not only pronounce this body to be a monster, but assuredly they might conclude that such a body could not longer endure. And no less monstrous is the body of that commonwealth where a woman bears empire. For either it does lack a lawful head, or else there is an idol exalted in the place of the true head. So this is the misshapen and disfigured reality of the monster that Knox invokes. And what does fantasy do with the monstrous? It takes the metaphor and it makes it literal. It makes it real. This is the work of fantasy, to materialize metaphor. Why? Because by doing this, it is able to give the metaphor life, so that it becomes part of a changing and changeable environment, where it may then transform, adapt, modify its trajectory, even while remaining true to the terms of its original creation. Thus, in Knox's realist world, a woman on the throne is like a physically distorted and monster-like creature. In Pratchett's fantastical world, this physical distortion or difference is given actual form. It is no longer like a vampire, it becomes a vampire or a werewolf or a troll or a gnome. Everyone's got secrets they don't want known, Angoa says to Polly. Werewolves are a bit like vampires in that way. We're tolerated if we're careful. That I can understand, said Polly. So are we, she thought. Okay. So fantasy then allows this monster to carry the narrative into the future, allowing it to interact with and qualify the realistic environment in which it's been placed. The questions that fantasy allows this monster to raise, therefore, are quite different from those that realism would have allowed for. While realism uses the metaphor of the monster to shut down any dialogue with it, because you cannot speak to a monster, confining it in the cage of imminent apocalypse, fantasy lets the monster out and allows the universe, the multiple universes that it brings into being, to unfold, and interrogates each of these possible universes as to its desirability and its feasibility. You're the monstrous regiment, you are. They say you've got a troll and a vampire and an Igor and a werewolf. They say you overpowered Prince Heinrich and his guards and made him hop away in the altogether. Fantasy gives metaphorical monsters flesh and blood, thus enabling the narrative to reveal their humanity, and indeed to put these notions of humanity and monstrosity in a dialectical relationship, rather than the Manichaean relationship to which realism consigns them. They can be either good or evil, and so on. Thus, Pratchett allows us also to see the perceived monstrosity of Knox's women, that the perceived monstrosity of Knox's women lies in their courage and prowess, and their refusal to remain locked in the cages that patriarchy puts them in. There is a very real monster in Pratchett's fantasies, however. I quote, "The fire gleamed off Jackram's face. In the red glow, his dark little eyes were like holes in space, his grinning mouth the gateway to a hell, his bulk some monster from the abyss." Unquote. Pratchett has, yeah, I see that in the comments. Pratchett has engaged in various ways. With this thing, he alternatively calls the abyss, the summoning dark, the beast. It is the essence of evil in Pratchett's world, and it creates a very particular kind of hell. In The Night Watch, he defines the evil that lurks in the hearts of men as a result of how close men lived to the beast. Such people were simply men without a shield. They looked at the world and realized that all the rules didn't have to apply to them, not if they didn't want them to. They weren't fooled by all the little stories. They shook hands with the beast. Unquote. In different contexts, the beast or the summoning dark or the abyss become different things. In Monstrous Regiment, that thing is war. Neil Gaiman once said that Terry Pratchett was not a kindly, funny old man writing about trolls and gnomes for kids or adults. He was a very angry old man, writing about the terrible things the world did to kids and adults through trolls and gnomes. That is, he was writing through trolls and gnomes. And so Monstrous Regiment is nothing if not an anti-war tract. Pratchett produces the horrors of war in large, sweeping pictures and in tiny details. But it is as well to remember that the women who join the army are fleeing to this terrible war as relief from their lives, lives that are made miserable in large part by the brutality of sexism and patriarchy. Igorina joins because the clan will not allow women to be surgeons and requires them to stick to their stitching. Polly joins for the sake of inheritance because she cannot inherit the family business. Lofty and Tonker run away from physical and sexual abuse. Shufti is pregnant and cannot remain at home. These women have been disowned by patriarchal structures they can no longer survive in. And it is the details of the horrors that they are running away from, hinted at, gestured towards, indirectly referenced, that point to the true hell in this book. If, for instance, Tonker is crazy and believes in a woman who may or may not be dead, something has driven her to this insanity. And again, where realism could and has drawn the horrors of misogyny with stark and powerful effect, fantasy gives us the Duchess who cries because the prayers of women hurt her. Fantasy produces this monstrous hell as the birth of a goddess, raised into being by the intensity of the belief of the insane. How then, between the two hells of misogyny and war, does Pratchett deal with the question of a feminist future? In many ways, big and small, he prepares us for the end of the story, which the reader anticipates as the endless future, the unchanging and eternal ever after that fantasy is allowed to create. And he does this by dismantling the category of gender entirely. He begins the very first night Polly spends with her regiment, with the basics, genitalia. A pair of rolled up socks serves as adequate addition to the cut hair and borrowed pants. The rest is nose picking, farting, belching loudly, walking stupidly, learning to swear. Is it biology? Pratchett seems to be asking. Well, let's see if a pair of rolled up socks might not fix that. And thereafter, the socks serve as literal and metaphorical gender markers. When confronted by the traits of masculinity, the women tell each other, it's the socks. It's like they pull you forward the whole time. It's like the whole world spins around your socks. This is Shufti. By the end of the book, when Polly must decide on a course of action, I quote, she told herself, it doesn't have to go this way. You don't have to let a pair of socks do the talking, unquote. Is gender a matter of learned behavior and socialized identity? Pratchett asks. Polly learns masculinity. There was a certain sockness, we're told at one point, that felt ashamed. And finally, after a veritable Shakespearean round of women dressing as men, dressing as women, pretending to be men, and so on, Polly has to convince their Lieutenant Blouse that they are not actually men. Quote, we all are, sir, really women, not just dressed up as women. And right now, I don't want to put any trousers on because then I'd be a woman dressed up as a man, dressed up as a woman, dressed up as a man. And then I'd be so confused, I wouldn't know how to swear. And I want to swear right now, sir, very much, unquote. By the end of the book, gender identity has become a fluid thing for the girls. At one point, we're told that Polly, quote, had gone from boy to girl just by thinking it, and it had been so easy. She needed some time to consider this. Such fluidity, Pratchett is careful to point out, is not relegated to women alone. The regimental officer, Lieutenant Blouse, is as unmasculine a young man as any that spent his boarding school childhood playing the female lead. There's nothing strange about this, as he tells his regiment. Fine old tradition, men dressing up as gals. In the sixth form, the chaps used to do it for a jape all the time. If we need a woman, I'm your man. Of course, this is entirely socially true, and Pratchett uses it to point to the complex layers of gender building that are so socially acceptable that they become invisible. Having spent a period of time dressed as a woman, there comes a time at which Blouse's inner Daphne causes him to apologize. Men take over, he sighs. It's probably because of the socks. Blouse is a complex picture, completely lacking in any sense of his own masculinity or the lack of it, recognizable as a type of genteel figure of a book-reading, well-mannered, cultured, and honorable aristocrat who comes into his own when he is bargaining for terms. I would like to consult with my men. Men, they're a bunch of women. But at this moment, said Blouse coolly, I would not care to exchange them for any 6 men that you offered me. So, indeed, Pratchett devotes much of the book to demasculinizing war and its trappings, recognizing how war and masculinity feed off of each other. So the regiment is called the Ins and Outs. Their symbol is a flaming cheese. Their leading officer, as we have seen, is an earnest young man by the name of Blouse. And as for the honor and glory, nationalism and patriotism, or dying for your country, Pratchett, as can be seen from these quotes that I've put up, is having none of it. It's all lies, he tells us. The pamphlet was patriotic, that is, they talked about killing foreigners. And the four horsemen, of course, are panic, bewilderment, ignorance, and shouting. So if men are so hopelessly trapped in their toxic masculinity, would the world be better run by women? Pratchett hears you asking. And his answer is, well, yes and no. I quote, "You only thought the world would be better if it was run by women," he tells us at one point, "if you didn't actually know any women. Especially old women," he points out, going on about how women are the ones who enforce tradition and culture upon other women, and how matriarchs are deeply implicated in the patriarchy and help run it better than actual patriarchs. And yet, not all gendered socialization is bad. When it comes to Polly's turn to kill the enemy, she sees some mother's son, some sister's brother, some lad who'd follow the drum for a shilling and his first new suit. If only she'd been trained, she thinks. If only she'd had a few weeks stabbing at straw men until she could believe that all men were made of straw. Is it the ways in which we learn to think about gender then, Pratchett thinks? And as any writer would, he turns to language and the ways in which gender is coded in it. And he dedicates the narrative to decoding and dismantling that language. So I've taken just a few examples, but the book, as you would know, is completely full of this. Just as metaphorical monsters can be neutralized by rendering them real, fantasy also uses its privilege to neutralize gender stereotypes by literalizing language, as one can see from these examples. Suddenly, the emasculation inherent in shouting, "All right, ladies," at soldiers, or the overt equating officers with gentlemen in the phrase "an officer and a gentleman," are turned on their heads by the soldiers in question being women. And so there's this, that's the trouble with good guys, they're all guys. Abominable women instead of abominable man. We never leave a man behind, and so on. As one after the other characters are revealed to be women of the regiment, only Maledicta the vampire is left undisclosed. The reader is left wondering why, until one realizes that by the end of the book, gender has been so erased as a marker that Maledicta's revelation is entirely inconsequential to anyone. Pratchett actually gives Polly's complete indifference to it in terms of her thoughts going to other matters, thinking that what she would be doing now if she'd never left, how good it would be to take a bath, and so on, as Maledicta confesses to being female. One's gender, once so central, is now completely inconsequential to the identity of the person. After the initial puzzlement at Polly's complete unconcern, the reader feels this too, and finds that looking back on Maledict/Maledicta, it makes absolutely no difference to the character whether we had known that she was female or not. Similarly, even after we know that the uber male soldier Jackram is actually a woman, the text continues to refer to her as him. Is that it? You might think. Yes, you're you. That's good. I'm me, whoever I am. Tonker stonker. It's all just people. But this is not a position one can simply assume. It has evolved out of its own context. It comes from its own history that authorizes it. As Polly says, a lot has happened in the last week. What does all this have to do with the future, Pratchett asks, or rather a newspaper reporter asks. Quote, "Do you think the world would be a different place if more women were soldiers?" Unquote. Of course, Pratchett deliberately leaves actual speculation on the future unanswered. But Jackram does acknowledge to Polly, "I expected better of them, really. I thought they'd be better at it than men. Trouble was, they were better than men at being like men. They do say the army can make a man of you, huh? So whatever it is you're going to do next, do it as you. Good or bad, do it as you." That is the future Pratchett is offering his characters. It isn't as if the adventures of the women have not changed the possibilities that the future can hold. I quote, "And now, it wasn't that good things were happening, we're told. It was just that the bad things had stopped. But bad things would not remain stopped forever, just because this is a fantasy. This was not a fairy castle," Pratchett happily reminds us, and there was no such thing as a fairy tale ending. But sometimes you could threaten to kick the handsome prince in the ham and eggs. And to kick or not to kick, That is now the choice. The future is a choice, and the monsters are still out there, needing a good kicking, as Polly goes out to start her own regiment. But this time the girls can decide for themselves what they want to be. It's your choice, she tells the recruits. A choice? They wonder. Certainly, says Polly. Notions of utopia keep changing, Pratchett reminds us. After all, Thomas More's utopia had a strict penal system, with criminals becoming slaves, and those guilty of premarital sex were punished by a lifetime of enforced celibacy. The fantastical feminist futurescape at the end of Monstrous Regiments is best summed up in Polly's final realization. All we were given was a chance, thought Polly. No miracle, no rescue, no magic, just a chance. That's it. That's my paper.
Thank you so much. Just 1 second while there we go, my camera didn't want to start. Okay, perfect, thank you. You've caused quite a lot of questions to come up, which is fantastic. So I'll just jump straight into them and start with the first one, which is, why do you think Terry was particularly able to write female characters so well?
Oh God, I don't know. I know it's I mean, you know, as a literary critic and a feminist and doing all this work in gender, I'm constantly annoyed by men pretending they can write as women. You know, D.H. Lawrence sucks and so on. I don't know. I really don't. I think that there is a sense of true humanism that makes this possible. That he really, in his head, is not is not prey to these masculinist preconceptions. In short, I don't know. I really don't. I mean, he's fabulous. That's why.
Well, that's very honest. Okay, how do you think that Pratchett's portrayal of patriarchy and religion have evolved from small gods to monstrous regiment?
Oh my God. Oh, that's a very big question. I think that his view of religion has not really changed. He's just showing us different aspects of religion. And so if there's one thing that I think that Pratchett is very, very clear about, and he does this again and again, is the importance of belief. You have to believe something. And that ritual and gods are manifestations of our belief, and that in many cases this is a good thing, that you have to believe in loyalty or love or fairness or whatever it is. And if you do, it will manifest effects. I'm going to quote John Keats here. I know I shouldn't, because again, he's a dead white man. But Keats says that there are three categories of real things. And so he talks about, you know, the universe, the cosmos is real, and then man-made structures are real. And then he says the third thing is not real at all, but it, like love or loyalty. He says, but it is rendered real by the ardor of the pursuit. And I think that's what Pratchett gives us. He gives us the ardor of the pursuit, the importance of believing in things that you would like to have real. And then, of course, you know, he gives us the other side of it that we see in Monstrous Regiment, which is the destructive side. What happens when you stop creating the gods and the gods start creating you, when fear becomes God instead. So, yeah.
Okay. Right. So the next question is, do you think that Terry Pratchett presented women overall more favorably than men? And if so, why?
I think that I'm not sure that that's entirely true. I think we think that he does that because we're always at the seat's edge, thinking that something will go wrong here. He'll misstep or do something wrong because he's a man writing about women, or he's a white man writing about Middle Eastern men, or he's a human being writing about trolls, whatever. But I mean, I think that he gets the big things right. He gets class and gender and race right, because he is very careful to do it. I think he's extra careful about when he's writing, especially about race. I saw earlier something about, the different countries and how maybe isn't he stereotyping them? You can tell immediately which country he's writing about because of the stereotypes. But of course, I mean, that is the point of satire. That's the point of satire. You should be able to take the stereotype and then laugh at it, a defining thing at all. I think that's the thing. He gets gender right in the way that he gets race and class right.
That makes sense to me. Okay. Ruchira Mandal, who was presenting yesterday, said, I've read opinions that the dwarf women wanting to wear skirts and lipstick is reverse feminism. I don't agree. I would like your view on it. And she says, how does your concept of the feminine monstrous fit into the depictions of female dwarf bodies in the Discworld novels?
Yeah. So this was, well, it's a great question, and one of the reasons that I'm a little hesitant to answer it is because it's one of the things that I thought about when I was saying that he erases gender. I don't think that he erases gender. I think he shows you how gender markers are irrelevant. You can mark your gender any way you want. It should not therefore define you. And so I think that if Cherry wants lipstick, it doesn't define her as a dwarf. It simply sort of signals to us the gender expression that she wants to give. And so this is in gender studies, this is a big thing. I mean, what is the difference between gender and sexuality and biological sex and so on? And so gender expression is the big one, that you can be a lesbian, but you wish to express your gender as something else. And so I think he points that out because it's not as if he's saying that Cherry is less of a woman or that she needs the lipstick in order to sort of make her feminine. He's just saying that femininity is different from femaleness. And people should have the choice to wear lipstick or not to wear lipstick. And it shows us a kind of evolving consciousness of gender identity that we see in Cherry. So that's why I think it's important. The second part was the feminine monster.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Jackrum, sort of?
Let me scroll. Sorry, there's millions of questions, and I've lost the right. Oh, she says yes, it's about choice. Maybe that was referring to the previous. Yeah, that was referring to your previous point. Sorry, I've lost you.
I'm sorry. I should have remembered. I mean, I think if it is about like the female monster or the feminine monster.
She said, how does your concept of the feminine monstrous fit into depictions of the female dwarf body in the Discworld novels?
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the feminine monstrous is very different. I think the way that Knox defines it is that anything feminine put above men is monstrous because it's against the laws of nature. Whereas what Pratchett is doing is questioning the so-called laws of nature themselves and said there are no laws. These are man-made things and they should not be. Even though when women make them, they're often no better, as Jackrum, says, that he thought that the world would be better, but it actually wasn't. So I'm not sure that answers it. But yes, as Kristeva discusses, absolutely, yes.
Okay. And actually, you led quite nicely into this question a couple of statements ago. The question is it beneficial to read fantasy parallel to the historical context where it's set, in terms of looking at subjects like feminism and the treatment of people? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I understood it. On the one hand, you read fantasy sort of in its historical context, and on the other hand, what?
These ideas like feminism, and when they come up in the fantasy novels, should you put them in the context of when the fantasy is or not?
Is set or written? I think that this, this sort of relationship between text and context is always dialectical, right? I mean, you place a text in its historical context if it will help you understand it better. right? So I quote constantly that first line of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, it is a truth universally acknowledged. I mean, I use it to say her universe was the little, tiny area of aristocratic England in the countryside in the early 1800s. And yet I use her ideas whenever I teach literature about this idea of a universe, which is a contract between the reader and the writer. So I think in some ways it's really important to historicize and contextualize a text. In other ways, when it's not relevant, no. I mean, I think it's a constant sort of dialectical relationship. They feed off of each other, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. I'm not sure if this actually answers the question.
I think so. It's something that I've thought about a few times, which is, I mean, Terry Pratchett's work is kind of, it crosses so many boundaries in terms of when to classify it. It's not really true to say it's just sci-fi or it's just fantasy fiction. It's parody as well, as you say, and so I guess you're kind of doing it a disservice if you don't bear in mind what the backdrop is that's being referred to, but at the same time, that's not the whole story. Like, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it's not history. It is fiction for a reason, right? I mean, we know that most history is also fiction, but
well, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I think. Hang on. Do we think Pratchett and this would fall under Butlerian views of gender and performativity?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the idea that gender is a performance, and the whole performativity of that excellent Butler's text of 92, I think it was. It is amazing. It really is. I mean, I think that he is very, very clear about that. So you have the Igorina, for instance. You have, Angua, who is a wolf. You have Lady Sybil, who her whole performativity of gender is so different if she bothers ever to do it at all. And he is very clear about this. He is very clear about the difference between feminineness and the performance of gender, even with the men. I mean, he's very, very clear about that. It's actually a great example of Butler's thesis.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we've run out of our time just now. So thank you once again.
Thank you, James. This was wonderful.